Dinky, A Filly That Is Loved by Vincent 5000X. Chapter 2, One Life Saved. Derpy couldn't tell how long she sat there, cradling the baby unicorn in her arms, only that by the time she realized where she was, the sun had long gone down. Now what do I do? Derpy questioned herself. The baby unicorn still looked very weak, needed food and medical attention as soon as possible. But the hospital was miles away, and Derpy doubted the infant would survive the bumpy journey in its state. Looking out towards the street, Derpy's heart sank as she saw just how barren it was. Every pony had already gone home. No one passing by had even noticed her as she sat in the alleyway. A new feeling of sadness swept over Derpy as she realized that no pony would have even known about the baby filly. Each would have continued on their path, whether it be home or to a friend's. The baby unicorn's dried wails would have never reached outside the alleyway. Derpy couldn't help but thank Celestia that she had entered the alleyway. Even though it was by chance, she was happy she had. Suddenly, Derpy knew what she would do. Her father was a police pony and would know exactly what to do in these kinds of situations. He also had enough medical training that she knew he would be able to help the baby filly. Her house wasn't even that far, a whole lot closer than the hospital was. Making sure the filly was wrapped safely in her blanket, Derpy carefully set her on her back. Using her wings, she held the bundle in place. It would take longer to get home walking rather than flying, but Derpy knew that this would provide the baby filly with the most comfort and safety that she could provide. As she expected, it was a long walk back to her home. She had stopped several times to check on the baby filly. Each time, she was greeted by a weak smile and small amber eyes. Every now and then, the infant would cry out in pain for a moment or two. Each cry caused Derpy to make more careful steps. She knew that the filly was crying because she was hurt and hungry. All she had to offer was water and a blanket, and she knew that the baby filly needed a lot more than that. Walking up to the front door, Derpy couldn't help but sigh sadly as she found it locked. Whenever her father was home, he would leave it unlocked. He was a well-respected pony in the city. He always did his best for those around him. He even decided to live in a house on the ground, rather than in the clouds like most other Pegasus ponies. I don't want to look down at other ponies, whether physically or morally, he would say in his calm voice, whenever the topic was brought up. It only made him more respected. But it was the fact that he was not home yet. Derpy knew he worked late some nights, but she had prayed to Celestia that he would be home early for once. But she knew she couldn't dwindle on that thought. The baby filly on her back needed help, and standing on the doorstep thinking was in no way, shape, or form helping. Walking through the house, Derpy ignored everything as she made her way for the kitchen. It wasn't the biggest room in the house, but it was large enough to fit everything a kitchen needed. It even had a space for a table and 2 chairs. She didn't want to, but Derpy placed the small filly that had been on her back onto the table. The baby filly laid almost motionless as she stared at Derpy. The only real movements coming from the infant were blinks and breathing. "Please don't move," Derpy whispered to the filly. She had to get some supplies, and if the filly had stayed on her back, it would have been almost impossible to get them all. Luckily, though, everything she needed was in the kitchen. Her gaze never left the filly for more than a few seconds. Returning to the filly, Derpy had acquired a full medical kit and several ointments. She also had a few cloths and a small bin of fresh water. Setting everything on the table next to the filly, Derpy proceeded to unwrap her from the blanket. She couldn't help but notice all the cuts and bruises, some showing signs of getting worse. Using a damp cloth, she quickly began cleaning the baby filly, removing both the dried blood and layers of dirt. Derpy knew that babies were more susceptible to infection and prayed that the filly had not already contracted something dangerous. As she wiped the cuts and bruises, the filly would twitch in pain. Each time it brought a tear to Derpy's eyes. She would wipe more carefully each time she noticed a twitch. Once the filly was clean, Derpy began applying the ointments to their respective wounds. She made sure each cut also had a bandage applied. She wanted to do more, but it was the best she could do with what she knew. Then, without taking her glance off the filly, Derpy grabbed a muffin from a nearby counter. Setting herself on the ground with the filly snug in one of her arms, Derpy began giving her some of the muffin. She knew it wasn't what babies should eat, but it was literally all there was in the house. She was supposed to shop that day, but things had obviously not gone as planned. The young unicorn could barely remember the long journey she had just been on with the kind pony. All she could remember was the small shots of pain and the never-ending hunger. But the kind pony would keep checking on her throughout the journey, slowing down whenever the bumps made parts of her small body hurt. Finally, the young filly felt the world close in around her, as the once open sky was replaced with bland-colored walls. Soon after, she felt herself laying on a hard surface and looking over at the kind pony. She could do little but stare and breathe as the pony moved about the strange room, looking for and grabbing several strange items. Then the pony walked back over to the young filly and removed the blanket, exposing the filly to the mildly warm air of the room. Suddenly, a cold cloth was run over her body. Every now and then, she felt a bit of pain as the cloth passed over several areas on her body. She couldn't help but twitch with each shock of pain, and in response, the kind pony would wipe more carefully. After the wiping was done, the pony put different substances on areas of the filly's body that hurt or felt sore. The substances eased some of the pain and soreness, as well as warmed her body more. She almost didn't notice the pony placing several sticky items on her body. They didn't annoy her, but she knew they were there. A few moments later, she felt herself being lifted off the hard surface and back into the pony's arm. She watched as the distance from her and the ceiling increased. Once the moving stopped, the baby filly found herself looking up into the kind pony's eyes. She liked the way they looked. She was so captivated by their color and how they looked that she barely noticed the strange item touching her lips. Like with the cool liquid from earlier, she opened her mouth as something dry yet soft was gently put in. Immediately, the baby felt a multitude of strange sensations. Whatever it was that had been placed in her mouth had a taste that seemed to cut into the baby filly's hunger, appeasing it a bit. The substance was so small that she nearly swallowed it whole, but acting on instinct, she began to chew on it with her small teeth. After it slid down her throat, she opened her mouth, hoping for more, and, like with the liquid from before, she received it. This continued for a while, only stopping when the baby filly was given more cold fluid to drink. But even after that, the substance would continue to be placed in her mouth, although she noticed that it would be placed in after longer periods of waiting as she continued to eat. After a while, it stopped entirely. The baby filly didn't care that it had stopped. An uneasy feeling had begun to develop in her stomach, and it was beginning to hurt. Before she could even cry, she felt herself being lifted up and placed next to the kind pony's head, her yellow hair covering the baby filly's face. Then something began to lightly rub her back. It made her feel warm and seemed to ease the clenching in her stomach. Burp. Derpy couldn't help but smile as she heard the small unicorn's burp. It was so cute. It reassured Derpy that she was doing good. For a moment, Derpy thought about giving the baby filly more of the muffin, but quickly decided against it. She was taking a risk giving such a young filly normal food. She wasn't going to continue. She was sure she had already given her enough for the time being. But still, she wished her father would come home and tell her what to do next. No sooner had this thought entered her mind that the sound of a turning lock filled the entire house. "Derpy, are you up?" Derpy's father called from another room. The sudden sound of the new voice caused the small filly to twitch in Derpy's grasp. "Shh, it's okay," she whispered as she continued rubbing the filly's back with her hoof. It caused the baby filly to calm down and snuggle closer to her head. "Derpy?" her father called again, although this time his voice held a tone of worry as it came from an adjacent room. Looking up, Derpy noticed the mess she left on the table. The cloth covered in dirt and dry blood stood out among all the medical supplies and ointments on the table. "Derpy?" Derpy could hear her father's crash through several objects as he rushed into the kitchen. He was still wearing the blue button-up shirt with his police belt, each blending in very well with his dark gray fur. His silver mane was evenly cut and complemented by his turquoise eyes almost perfectly. His cutie mark of a pair of handcuffs and a brown police baton just visible behind his belt. Turning to where Derpy sat, his eyes immediately fell on the small filly in Derpy's arms. He continued his stare for several moments, as several different thoughts seemed to run through his mind at once. Before he could say a single word, Derpy let loose with her explanation. Even if she could, she held nothing back as she told him about the baby filly she found and the horrid condition she found her in. "I brought her home because I knew you would know what to do," Derpy said as tears streamed down her face as she finished her explanation. She was still rubbing the filly's back, even though she had already fallen asleep, her calm breaths just blowing through Derpy's fur. "It's okay," her father responded quickly. He had been in situations like this before, so he knew how to handle things, but the look on his face was enough to say that he never expected it to involve his daughter. "You did the right thing," he continued as he looked over the baby filly in Derpy's arms. As her father carefully looked over the foal, Derpy silently waited for his response. She has obvious signs of abuse and food deprivation, he said after he finished his visual inspection. A scowl formed on his face. As her father thought, Derpy cradled the filly and got up from the ground. Moving back to the table, she took the blanket she had wrapped around the filly earlier and wrapped the filly back in it. Come on. The first thing we have to do is get this filly to the hospital, her father finally said after a moment. Once outside of the house, Derpy's father took the baby filly from her arms and flew off towards the hospital, Derpy flying close behind.